Well, thank you, Ernie, for a very exciting paper. Actually, Ernie gave us two papers. He's calling one the appendix. And from a philosophical point of view, I think they are loosely related, but there's a nice connection there somewhere. I'll be speaking about the main paper, so to speak, the paper entitled Intuitions. As you'll see, some of my points will connect with what Paul has said. I'll call your attention to that. But I may have a more radical worry than Paul's about Ernie's work on intuition. So for Ernie Sosa, intuition is a conscious propositional attitude or state that reliably allows us to discriminate the true from the false within a certain range of propositions, and is such that, and I quote, it can serve as a basis for belief and can thus help provide epistemic justification for the supported belief, unquote. I think this is the yield of groundbreaking work. We might be thinking of intuition along hopelessly inadequate lines if it weren't for his mostly persuasive admonition. But there is some reason for concern, and I'm afraid the sticky points don't all hinge on minor detail. According to Ernie, intuition is not merely a characteristic of belief. It is a fully fledged propositional attitude in its own right, one that, as he puts it, can serve as a basis for belief. I will want to question that claim, for it seems based on a less than compelling phenomenological account of the relevant facts. It will, however, prove more convenient to question that part of Ernie's work later. For the time being, notice that if intuition is a fully fledged propositional attitude, which is distinct from belief, Ernie may have to make significant changes in his account of intuitive knowledge. He claims that the phenomenology of intuitive knowledge differs from the phenomenology of perceptual knowledge in that, unlike the latter, the former does not allow for anything sandwiched between a belief and the fact that makes it true. However, if intuition is a conscious mental state which is independent from belief and the basis for intuitive belief, there seems to be, after all, something very substantially sandwiched between belief and fact, something that we are, or at any rate, can be aware of. I have a handout going around. I hope you all have that out. Thus, in view of this sandwich problem, the presumably distinctive characteristic of intuitive knowledge, its immediacy, vanishes. Now, is this a superficial problem for Ernie? It may well prove to be, but I wouldn't bet on it, because Ernie needs to account for the absence of grounds for doubt in cases of intuitive knowledge, and he expects to be able to do it by claiming immediacy for intuitive knowledge. Be this as it may, it should be interesting to see how an alternative account of intuitive belief and knowledge, the one I would like to ask Ernie to consider, will face no such problem. We may indeed need an alternative, and this will connect with one of Paul's points, my scope problem in the handout. In addition to the sandwich problem, Ernie's account of intuition does not seem to me to square well with certain very legitimate, apparently legitimate instances of intuition talk in philosophy. And I don't think these can easily be explained away in a fully worked out version of his account of the matter. This is the problem. When Ernie ponders the scope of intuition, he settles on an admittedly Cartesian view. Only very simple, easily understandable propositions about facts of our own mental lives, or about the truth of reason, the traditional epithet, can be objects of intuition. However, when discussing skepticism about empirical knowledge with our undergraduate students, we have all had occasion to either make or acquiesce to a claim such as the following. The skeptical claim that it is not rational for me to believe that I am now at a conference is counterintuitive. We usually say that. Even though this is couched in epistemological language and is ostensibly a third-order claim about the skeptical second-order claim that it is not rational for me to believe the first-order proposition that I am now at a conference, make no mistake about it. What accounts for the popularity of saying that it is intuitive for me, or any of us here, to believe that I am, or that any of us is, rational in believing that I am, or we are, at a conference, is not any inference from the conjunction of an epistemological theory we may subscribe to, according to which I am rational provided such and such conditions obtain, together with our belief that those conditions do obtain, to the conclusion that we are, after all, rational in believing that we are at a conference. The popularity of the anti-skeptical claim derives simply, it would seem, from the perception that it is intuitive for us here to believe that we are at a conference. If this were not the case, the skeptical claim would not elicit any response from the student who has some pre-theoretical concept of rationality but no familiarity with epistemological analysis of the concept. And yet we very well know how the skeptical claim is received by those who have no training in epistemology. But the proposition expressed by I am at a conference does not qualify as an object of intuition on Ernie's account of the matter. There seems to be nothing wrong, except perhaps for the epistemology with a questionable agenda, with our making claims to the effect that it is intuitive for me to believe that P, even when P is a proposition about the external world. Now, suppose the foregoing is completely misguided, and assent is inevitable when you make or deny the skeptical claim, no matter what the undergraduate student thinks he's laughing about. What can we now say is going on when we claim or deny that it is counterintuitive to hold me rational for believing that I know that I am at a conference? Well, that I know that I am at a conference is clearly not something that I can come to know simply by the exercise of introspection. Granted, introspection alone tells me that I believe that I am at a conference. But if I am minimally competent from a cognitive point of view, that belief, namely that I am at a conference, will be grounded on an inferential process involving a number of beliefs that I do not acquire by introspection, such as the belief that this is a conference room, and the speaker is now making a formal presentation, etc. And it is on the basis of such presumed items of empirical knowledge that I may come to believe that I know that I am at a conference, which is what we imply is intuitive when we are horrified by the skeptical claim. So disregarding dubious claims, trying to stay away from dubious claims about psychological reality, the kind of generalization that philosophers are always or often at a disadvantage to make vis-a-vis the cognitive scientists, it seems to me unproblematic to suggest that the ordinary inferential process for the extra cautious but not necessarily philosophical reasoner would be approximately as follows. This is a conference room. There's a speaker making a formal presentation, etc. Therefore, I am at a conference. And I have no reason to doubt that I am at a conference. Therefore, I know that I am at a conference. Or something like that. The philosopher would probably embellish this argument to death, of course. But the point here is simply to notice that the conclusion cannot reasonably be obtained by introspection alone. So we are led back to the same old conclusion. This instance of intuition talk seems to wreak havoc with Ernie's Cartesian account of the scope of intuitive knowledge. So I'd like to ask Ernie to consider an alternative. Consider the following hypothesis. That's in the handout, the so-called deflationary view there, my alternative. I intuitively believe that P at T, if and only if I am psychologically certain that P at T. On my understanding of the matter, thinking of intuition as a characteristic of belief may prove more fruitful than thinking of it as a fully fledged propositional attitude, as Ernie does. Now, what follows is my very brief explanation of the view that intuitive belief is merely psychologically certain belief, which I will refer to as the deflationary view. This is in honor of Paul, of course. We must, to begin with, have a firm enough grasp of the concepts of psychological certainty and epistemic certainty. You will find the distinction in the works of G. Moore and Peter Klein, among others. And, I'll confine my discussion to their work. Peter uses the term propositional certainty to refer to what I call epistemic certainty. In fact, Peter has a virtual monopoly on the concept of certainty nowadays. And I will, for our purposes here, assume that his analysis of the concept of epistemic certainty is correct. I will, however, have to focus momentarily on what seems to me an important flaw in his account of the distinction between psychological and epistemic certainty. Both Moore and Klein talk dismissively about psychological certainty, even though Peter has claimed that one knows that P only if one is psychologically certain that P. And I really like that. In fact, I'm not aware of any very polished analysis of the concept of psychological certainty in the epistemological literature. And that may well prove to be a minor scandal in contemporary epistemology, as I will be suggesting. But I have no doubt that we need at least a working understanding of that concept. Without it, there can be no hope of understanding the philosophical significance of certainty claims. It has been noticed that the proposition expressed by "I know that P, but I'm not sure that P," clearly seems paradoxical, contradictory, I would say. To be sure, this cannot by itself be a basis for deciding the dispute between those that do, like Peter and myself, and those that do not think that certainty is a necessary condition of knowledge. Precisely because it is not obviously wrong to think that psychological certainty is not a necessary condition of knowledge. But I would argue that no epistemology can afford to ignore the need for an account of the perceived absurdity of a claim such as, "I know that P, but I'm not sure that P," which calls for a discussion of psychological certainty, which in turn, as we'll see, requires having the concept of epistemic certainty before us. And you'll have that, that's Peter's analysis of the concept. You have that in the handout. So roughly for Peter, this is not verbatim, but it's approved by him. So I want to thank him for helping me out find this simpler formulation of this definition. So the concept, the proposition that P is epistemically certain for you, whether you believe that P or not, if and only if A, your justification for believing that P is strong enough for you to know that P, B, there is no true proposition that lowers your justification for believing that P, and C, any proposition that lowers your justification for believing that P is one that you were justified in denying. Notice that according to this definition, P must be true. If it weren't, there would be a true proposition that, if added to your belief system, would lower, indeed, would completely destroy your justification for believing that P, namely not P. Whether anything can be certain for you, according to that account of the epistemic meaning of the term certainty, is a huge topic that I can't even begin to tackle here. But one thing seems clear to me. Peter has set out to provide us with an analysis of the concept of epistemic certainty that is acceptable to both the skeptic and the epistemist, to borrow a nice term from Keith Blair. And it's far from obvious that he has failed. Now, what hasn't Peter done about certainty that needs doing and is directly relevant to our discussion of Verney's papers? I think neither he nor anybody else has done nearly enough to explain the connection between psychological certainty and epistemic certainty. Psychological certainty is usually understood as the highest degree of tenacity with which you cling to a proposition when it is an object of belief for you. You're psychologically certain that P when it seems entirely far-fetched to you that your belief that P may be false. Think of what is psychologically certain for you for a moment. If you're not a philosophical skeptic, it should seem entirely ludicrous to you that you may be wrong in believing that 2 plus 2 equals 4, or that you don't have that headache or hunger or cold or boredom, etc., that you feel right now, hopefully not. Or that your name is not such and such, fill in the blank with your real name. Or that you are not now at a conference. Notice how this assortment of examples of psychological certainty has no Cartesian allegiance. But aren't they the kinds of things that you would naturally claim to be certain about? Now think of your belief that the apartment building where you live is still standing where you left it this morning before coming here. You certainly believe, as you should, that it is still standing. But you're not ready to claim that you are certain that it is, are you? For all you know, a plane could have crashed into it 5 minutes ago and there wouldn't have been enough time for you to get the news of the tragedy. Isn't that right? Unfortunately, that horrendous possibility should seem a whole lot more credible to you than that you are still in bed dreaming about a philosopher who asks you to consider some horrific scenarios. Isn't that right? If you're anything like me, you'll have answered yes. I feel certain that I am now at a conference, and so do you, I suppose. I feel that I have conclusive evidence that I am now at a conference, if I consider the matter in those terms, and so do you, I suppose. So what do we do when we claim certainty for some of our beliefs? Do we claim that those certain beliefs are accompanied by the qualia associated with clinging to a proposition with the highest degree of tenacity? Most definitely not. At best, this is philosophical jargon for saying only a part of what we do when we ordinarily claim to be certain that so and so. What we do in claiming to be certain that P is to say that it is inconceivable to us that it may prove not to be the case that P because we have conclusive evidence that P. And here's what's missing from an account of the epistemic psychological certainty distinction in the works of those who most notably discuss the matter, namely Peter and Moore. There's no accounting for the truth of a certainty claim. Why? Why is that true? No account of that at all, so far as I can see. If your certainty claim is true, then you do have conclusive evidence for believing that P. And I don't think we need to dwell on the concept of conclusive evidence here. What the term conclusive evidence means here is non-misleading and overwhelming evidence, not entailing evidence. But on Peter's or Moore's dismissive account of the distinction, it would be a mere coincidence that you happen to cling so tenaciously to a proposition that is, in fact, epistemically certain for you. And also a coincidence that your certainty claim is true. Call it the coincidental view of certainty claims. Now, the coincidental view is insensitive to the need to account for the reliability of psychological certainty. This obviously connects with Ernie's claim that it can't be a coincidence that what you intuitively believe is true. And I would be with Ernie as against Paul in this regard. Since I propose to explain intuitive belief by identifying it with psychologically certain belief, I need the following connecting principles, and that's in the handout, the connecting principles. If you're psychologically certain that P, then the proposition that P is very likely epistemically certain for you. That accounts for the reliability bit. And you're psychologically certain that P only if you are disposed to believe that you are certain that P. So it should be easy to introspect. The conjunction of these principles accounts for both the truth of those certainty claims that are true, if any, and for the reliability of psychological certainty, if epistemic certainty is, in fact, attainable. Notice that the deflationary view thus accounts for intuitive knowledge without succumbing to the two objections we have raised against Ernie's view. There will be no sandwich problem here, and the scope of intuition will be as wide as intuition talk requires, with no problem assuming that intuitive knowledge stems from the familiar knowledge sources. So I'd be with Paul in this regard. So how well does the deflationary view sketched here fare in comparison with Ernie's proposal? My answer is not very well, unless we can remove a final obstacle. Ernie notes that intuition must be a propositional state in its own right, because there are cases, perceptual cases such as the Muller-Lyer lines, and conceptual cases such as the well-known paradoxes, where the intuitive pull of a proposition may survive the extinction of the belief which once had it as an object. Ernie is certainly right in thinking that one may feel attracted to a proposition that one has enough evidence to disbelieve, and that one is aware that one has enough evidence to disbelieve. So how do we account for that fact? Well, I don't feel the least bit inclined to believe that the mere attractiveness of having a given belief has anything to do with intuition as a propositional attitude. Consider wishful thinking, or at any rate, what psychologically causes its manifestation. Sometimes the practical consequences of believing that P are so good that we remain attracted to P even when we are perfectly aware of having enough evidence for disbelieving the P. Now think, for instance, of Russell's paradox. The very thought that not every grammatical predicate defines a class so complicates matters for us that there can be no doubt that we have to struggle intellectually to live with that apparent truth. We have to keep reminding ourselves of our reasons to disbelieve that comprehension axiom. Is that enough to claim that there must be a propositional attitude called intuition? Hardly, I would suggest. Consider the following analogy. Suppose the police have just confronted me with overwhelming evidence for believing that my kid sister, that sweet angel, is a serial killer. Being psychologically powerless to reject the tragic evidence that she's a monster, I can no longer believe that the sweet angel, that she is the sweet angel I've known and protected. And yet, having so firmly believed that she's a harmless angel for so long, I continue to feel attracted to the thought that she is, at bottom, a harmless little thing that I've always thought she was. But must we account for whatever remains of the intuitive pull of the proposition that my kid sister wouldn't kill a fly by saying that I intuit that P, whereas intuits that P if and only if something like Ernie's conditions are satisfied? My answer is not if we have a more conceptually economical account of the matter. And I submit that we do. We can say that even now I'm attracted to thinking of my kid sister as harmless because that makes me so much happier. It makes life so much simpler for me. Doesn't the same here go for the paradoxes? Don't the paradoxes steal conceptual simplicity away from us and threaten our rationality so acutely? And don't those Muller-Lyer lines exploit a flaw in our cognitive apparatus and make us feel erratic? Aren't they such a surprising threat to our all-important sense of spatial acuity? Isn't the fact that we are aware that things would be so much simpler for us if those premises of the paradoxical argument were all acceptable, or if those lines proved to be incongruent after all, enough to explain why we are so attracted to thinking the premises all acceptable or the lines incongruent, even in view of the unquestionable evidence to the contrary? So my little deflationary view depends on your answering yes. Now, when I called Ernie's paper groundbreaking, I wasn't just paying lip service to Ernie's status as a leading epistemologist. The deflationary view strikes me as a better explanation of the relevant facts than Ernie's account of them, but I also do believe that if the deflationary view proves untenable, then Ernie's account of the matter must be at least approximately right. Thank you.